So, more people coming in, but it's 2:30 here in Paris. Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Great to have you with us for this Ask the Author session. My name is Michael Claude. I'm the head of communications of the International Transport Forum, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. Our topic today, and you know what it is because you registered for it, is new mobility. If you Google new mobility, you will find a jumble of uses and descriptions. It's the membership publication of the United Spinal Association, which represents people with spinal cord injuries. But then it's also described as one of the 4 mega trends in transport, together with autonomous driving and digitalization and electrification, according to Roland Berger, the consultancy. So talking about new mobility is a little bit like, a walk through a foggy forest over shaky and shifting ground. And some light to show us a path, I think, will be welcome. The more so because new mobility has really become a buzzword. Again, if you Google it, you get about 4.7 million hits for new mobility. If you do the same thing for shared mobility, you get 880,000, I think it was. So we should probably take the phenomenon seriously. But to take it seriously, we need to know what exactly is it, how is it being used, how it can best serve our societies, and that's what inspired what were the guiding questions behind our new report, Measuring New Mobility, Definitions, Indicators, Data Collection. It's the first output of the new ITF Mobility Innovation Hub, which you find more info under the link I'll post in a minute in the chat. It's a great new project we've started a little while ago. And I'm very, very pleased to have with me Rachele Poggi, who's the lead. There she is. Hello, Rachele. She's the lead author of this report, Measuring Mobility. She will take us through the main elements, aspects in a short 10-minute presentation. The idea is to give you a taste. And then the rest of the time will be for you to ask questions. If you want to ask a question, use the Q&A function, please, not the chat. Use the Q&A. That's where we pick up the questions. You can start doing that right away if you know your question now, so they build up and we go through them. Then at the end, this is being recorded, so we'll share the link with you so you can share it with colleagues or other interested parties afterwards. And without further ado, as moderators like to say, I hand over to Rachele to take us through the essentials of measuring new mobility. Rachele, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all to be here for this presentation. I will present you today the new ITF report, Measuring New Mobility, Definition, Indicators, Data Collection. The report was written by me and Nick Carros. As all of you know, in the last decade, the spectrum of new mobility services and vehicles widened and the pace has accelerated since 2020, and in particular in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. But how can we define them? How can we measure them? How can we get the necessary data to understand this new phenomenon? This report helps to reply to all these questions. The report has 3 main objectives. The first objective is to define the wide range of new mobility services and vehicles. If we want to measure something, we need first of all to define it. The second objective is to develop a list of policy-relevant indicators that can help public authorities and policy makers to measure what is happening. The last one is to explore ways to collect comparable and continuous data in order to track relevant trends and inform policymakers. These data are mainly owned by the private service providers, and they need a new approach to be collected. Let's come back to the first objective. First of all, with the term new mobility, we refer to intra-urban passenger mobility services and vehicles enabled by digital technologies. The classification of new mobility services proposed in the report aims to provide functional definition, avoid ambiguous terms, and create a logical and consistent structure for comparing and grouping different services according to feature of interest. The classification used in the report has two important characteristics. First of all, it is flexible enough to include all existing new mobility services and allow the future inclusion of services that do not exist yet. Secondly, it enables the comparison with more established mobility services such as public transport and popular transport. This is a very important point because new mobility cannot be analyzed in a separate way, but should be analyzed in the context of the overall mobility. Coming back to the classification used in the report, new mobility services are grouped around two main types: ride services and fleet sharing. As you can see from the picture in the slide, public and popular transport can be included in this spectrum. Ride services are those services that provide the travel with access to rides where the traveler is the passenger and not the operator of the vehicle. This category includes ride sourcing, microtransit, and ride pooling. Fleet sharing refers to services that provide temporary access to vehicles owned by the platform. The customer operates the vehicle themselves for one or more trips and then returns or parks the vehicle. Bicycle and e-bike sharing, e-scooter sharing, moped and e-moped sharing, and car sharing are included in this category. For the classification of new mobility vehicles, we follow the same approach as for the services. We identified three top-level categories: micromobility, power-like mobility, car or van-like vehicles, and 27 vehicles. In the report, there are detailed definitions of each vehicle represented in the icons in the slide. As you can see, this vehicle include also traditional vehicles since new mobility was born and is constantly developing in the existing world. In addition, it is worth to note that this list is not exhaustive and new vehicles can be included in the future years. The same service can be performed by several vehicles and the same vehicle can perform different services. The picture in the slide gives a snapshot of the possible combination between services and vehicles. In the second part of the report, we developed a list of performance indicators with which new mobility services can be measured. It is important to note that whenever possible, these indicators should be calculated also for other modes and not only for new mobility services. We identified 5 main categories: sustainability, safety, utilization, accessibility, and equity. For each category, 3-4 indicators are detailed, as you can see in the table. This category is, this list is of course not exhaustive, but can be a good starting point to measure this phenomenon. I will not enter into detail of each indicator, but I will just say that for each one, we explain the policy mandate and the policy actions that can be taken based on the result. We also give some consideration on the challenges of the use of this indicator. We also suggest which data are needed and how to calculate the indicators. Finally, we give example of the use of these indicators. Once the list of indicators is set, we need the data to calculate them. And here the challenges come. Most of the data, as I said before, are owned by private companies. This requires a different approach compared to the measurement of traditional modes. There are 3 main approaches for public authorities to receive data from private providers. Public authorities can ask raw data and then decide which indicator calculate. This requires in-house knowledge on how to analyze this data. Otherwise, public authorities can select the indicators of interest and ask the service providers to only report the necessary data. There is a third approach that consists in assigning the task of collecting and analyzing the data to third-party data processors. The report details the pros and cons of each approach. The second aspect to consider for data reporting is data structure and format. There should be a common understanding of terms, data structure, and data reporting with specific machine encodable and readable formats. The report gives example of existing syntaxes and formats. Finally, public authorities should decide under which agreement private companies report data. There are different possibilities here. Data reporting can be compulsory. It can be used as a condition for service providers to have the operating license. Private companies can also decide to cooperate with public authorities and report data, or they can sell them to the public authorities. It is difficult to identify one single best agreement. Public authorities should choose the most suitable agreement to request the data based on their adopted indicators. With this, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will give back the floor to Michael.
Thank you very much, Rachele, for covering a lot of ground in very short time, and for keeping to the time so we can have some questions. Now is the time for you out there, wherever you are, to type your questions into the Q&A. Rachele will do her best to answer them, but we will also share with you contact details. So if you want to follow up, that'll absolutely be possible. I'm looking at the Q&A, and I don't see any questions, which is great, because that gives me the privilege to. Oh, there's one coming in. Let me pose this question directly. This is from Carlos Pardo. Do you have any suggestions around data standards for transport? There are several.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, there are several data standards, and in the report we are mentioning the most used data standard. We are not doing any specific recommendation on which to use, but we recommend to use a common one and agreed between the public authorities and service providers. Like these service providers, when they have to report data, they can use the same standard, and also public authorities, when they receive data from different service providers, they receive all in the same standard. So yes.
And a related question comes in from Christian Vogel, who asked, are there any plans to regulate data standards across regions, for example, the EU and the US and China? I guess other regional organizations like ASEAN might come to mind.
For the moment, we are not planning to regulate the data standard. We will work for sure to, with the different stakeholders, with the public authorities, with the service provider, to standardize at the most the data reporting, but we don't have the force of regulating it. What we can do is to suggest the best way to do it.
Are you aware of efforts to do this somewhere? Are there projects that actually are tackling this?
Yes, there are projects. There is the mobility data specification that is one of the most used standard. There are some initiative from the EU, but this is what it exists.
And a question from Brendan Hemley about data sharing, which I guess is at the very heart of the challenge here. Mobility providers often resist providing data, citing privacy concerns. What is your opinion about this challenge?
Yes, it is definitely a challenge, the privacy, especially in the EU with the GDPR regulation. One of our recommendation is for public authorities to ask aggregate data, to find a way to not to have for example, all the trips with all the location, but having specific requests to data to private companies, so they can provide data at the aggregate level, and this can be a solution to the privacy problem. And also some specification as the MDS has already some form for solve the problem of data privacy.
And another question on data sharing. This seems to be a very hot topic from Terry Graham, who writes, you mentioned several agreements for data sharing. Is there a preference building in the community for one type of agreement? Plus, what efforts are there to integrate the new mobility vehicles with the existing public transport systems? So 2 questions. Is there are we coalescing around certain types of agreements? And what is happening in terms of integrating public transport as we know it with new mobility services and vehicles?
Yes, first of all, I want to make a clarification on the term that, like, in the report, we are talking about that data reporting and not data sharing, because like data sharing refers more to data shared among different stakeholders to enable mobility services. So it's what is happening with the mobility as a service work. We are mainly talking about data reporting, so like data that private companies are reporting to the the public authorities.
The second question
yeah, was just a clarification. There is not a real preference for agreement. It really depends on the willingness between of public authorities and private companies. As I said in the presentation, it depends on what the public authorities want to reach with this data. If they think that some data are essential to evaluate this new mobility service, they can make the reporting of this data compulsory for the service providers, or in the case they can use the data reporting as a leverage to have the license to operate in a certain jurisdiction. If they see that it's difficult to collaborate with the private companies, they can decide to buy this data. So there are different possibilities, and it really depends on the availability, on the resource of the public authorities.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can slip in a question of my own there, because I find this really interesting. Why should public authorities trust the data that are reported by the service providers? I mean, obviously, is there potentially a trust issue there?
Yes, there are definitely trust issues between the public authorities and the service providers. There should be trust from both sides, and it's important. According to in my opinion, it's important that public authorities explain why there is the need for this data. I think that when private companies understand that the use of this data are also beneficial to them, they can gain something from sharing this data to the public authorities. I think, for example, we know that there is an issue with the perception of safety for a lot of new mobility vehicles in cities. It can be of interest also of the private companies to understand that report this data on the use, on the crashes, on the injured, can be beneficial to the perception that citizens have of their services. So I think that it's important that there is this trust between public authorities and service providers, and also that the private sector understand the importance of reporting this data in the right way.
It seems like there's a battle, will be a battle about the reporting standards. I see several contributions and questions here that sort of are pitches for various standards. We have someone asking whether BMW's Catania X standard could be Catania X could be a forum to standardize data exchange, or whether it's ISO 15638. Do you expect that will be a tug of war, and in the end we end up with various standards that compete, or do you see a real possibility that there can be some coalescing around a unique standard?
Yes, in the specific, we didn't consider, we didn't analyze this type of standard, but we can definitely think about. And I want to say that there are also other reports of ITF and also new report that will deal with the with this specific topic. And also there will be a new report about measuring new mobility next year, where we were talking more on the practical side. So for sure there will be more detail on the practical issue and the practical recommendation on the standard to use.
Here's an interesting question from Martin Lefranc, asking about robotaxis, which he says seem to be sitting somewhere between shared services and the taxi and ride-hailing on the other side. Where do you think sort of automated mobility service come in here within the new mobility spectrum that you've showed us this nice diagram with the classroom sitting?
But the automated services are part of the ride services, because the customer is not operating the vehicle. So for sure, like for the moment, we didn't include these services yet. But as I said, the classification is quite open. So we can we will definitely include in the future this type. I would say that it's more ride services, since the customer is not operating directly the services, but is like a passenger.
And another question from Christian Vogel, who asked whether we looked only at new mobility for people, for passengers here, or whether sort of the last mile and delivery services and freight was also part of what you looked at.
In this report, we only looked we only look to the mobility, the passenger mobility, and it was like the focus of this report. We said clearly in this at the beginning that we are not looking at freight transport in city, but these last mile solution for goods are will be definitely the topic for future work of ITF. So we will consider for sure this very important topic.
Looking forward to that. Talking about which the indicators. I mean, one of the aspects here is to really benchmark new mobility, to be able to say, oh, you know, what is the benefit and how's it performing against maybe other forms of mobility. In those indicators, did you also consider public opinion, kind of how that reflects on new service, because obviously in policy decisions that can be an important factor.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree that like new mobility is an hot topic also for the general public. I think that like at the end, the final aim of this list of indicators and of having these indicators for public authorities is really to inform the public, is to let them understand that new mobility, as I already said, are not different from other transport modes, that they should be considered as all the others. So I think that these indicators can help in putting new mobility in context. So I think that it's like this list is really done also for the publics to let them understand that they should not be like, how to say, like scared of new mobility, of new things.
You mentioned in your presentation that the way you want to measure new mobility, you looked at ways to also make it comparable to other modes of transport, to allow that sort of cross comparison. Are there areas where that's not possible, where kind of you have a standalone pillar new mobility, or did you find that a relatively doable task?
No, there are definitely some that can only like be calculated for new mobility. For example, when we look at the alternative mode replace, like it's something that it's for new mobility. So we are asking which mode the new mobility services are replacing. So this can be done mainly for the new mobility services. And it's also an important question that policymakers should ask to themselves, because if the new mobility services are substituting public transport, for example, there is still work to do, because it means that the private cars are still there, the private motorcycles are still there. So we need, but this, for example, it's an indicator specific to new mobility.
We have 5 more minutes, so if you have questions, then now is the time to put those into the Q&A. While you're doing that, I'll ask another question of my own, and this is about affordability. When I take one of these electric bikes, shared bikes, from my home to my office, it costs me about 4 times that of a subway ticket. So I wonder whether that's something that people can really afford, or is that something you're looking at as well, that dimension?
We are not looking at that, at this specific aspect in the equity, I would say equity indicators, but we are like, it's definitely, and we also mentioned in the report, it's definitely something that it's worth to look, and I think it will be the object of the topic of other reports. And I think that this it's something that should be taken into consideration in the future. In this report, we did some choices, and for the equity aspect, there were some other indicators that were more important and to calculate. But for sure, it's we will take into consideration for a new project.
Thank you. And there are 2 short questions. That's great. We'll treat those 2, and then we'll come to an end. 3 questions, my God. There'll be a window popping up on your screen with a small poll with 2 questions. We just want to know whether this is worth your time, so we can improve the format and see whether we're doing the right thing. So don't be shocked. There'll be a window popping up in a second or 2. While I'm asking the final questions. One is from Sarah Lynch, and she's asked whether you've also worked on collecting exposure data in order to give context to KSI data. What is KSI? Maybe you know.
It's a key safety indicator, I think. Yes, like actually there are some but actually, like, there are some exposure data, like when we talk about the use and the PKM, or the number of trips by vehicle type, this can be used to calculate the KSI indicator. So yes, we are taking into consideration this.
Right. Walter Dritter has asked a very short question. Which of these new mobility services are really fossil-free?
These I'm like
so
afraid that not sure, but like in the list of indicators, we have like something about the average vehicle lifespan, and this can be like a indicator about like the impact, the environmental impact of these vehicles. And there are already some other report of ITF on these. Great,
thanks. So final question, does the data framework include identification of where the new mobility devices are used? For example, footpaths, shared paths, bike lanes, bus lanes, traffic lanes. That can be quite interesting information.
Yeah. No, for the moment, like this, it's a very specific, and also like when we create the list of indicators, we had also to take in mind what was feasible to calculate and not too difficult. So for the moment, no, not this. We have like some one indicator on the share of passenger kilometers traffic traveled on low street routes, but even if it's not exactly the same.
Thanks very much. And Sarah Lynch's
okay. Yes,
KSI is killed and seriously injured. Just for those who are not kind of on the inside of this, KSI killed and seriously injured. It's good to know. We come to the end. We're exactly on time. That's perfect. I stop with the last comment here I have from Salvage Saavedra, which is a comment, not a question. I'll read it to you. I ask ITF to consider using the word logistics when talking about transporting goods and services, and the word mobility when talking about moving persons. That's worth considering. The terminology question is always always interesting. Mobility not so long ago was used for people with handicaps. We don't use that word either anymore. So the terminology is always in movement. We take note of your comments, Salvador, and I think we do that in many places, but there are also other ways of expressing it. Thank you so much for your time. It was great, many interesting questions. We could only touch on the surface here, but I think the idea is clear. We're trying to make a first step here to have a common framework, a common terminology to talk about this very, very heterogeneous world of new mobility, to be able to measure it, to benchmark it, and to provide those who have to take decisions in that area with the aim of helping us all to get about more easily and more seamlessly to make the right decisions. So thank you all very much. You will be receiving an email with the link to the recording on YouTube, which is already live now. You can also Google it. And if you want to get in touch with Rachele, she'd be very happy to engage with you and take this discussion further to build on what we talked about today. Thank you so much. Have a very good day, a very good evening, and see you next time to another Ask the Author here at the International Transport Forum. Bye-bye.
Thank you.